Hello, my name is Kelley Rutledge, and I want to thank you for joining me for this presentation, which is part of my completion requirements for my degree in Masters of Sustainable Energy Development at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. I would like to start with land acknowledgement. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. As this is an international project, I would like to also acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the Dene within the Four Sacred Mountains, which encompasses lands in Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. I would also like to extend a sincere thank you for my partners, Indian Country Grassroots Support, for partnering with me on this project and allowing me to come visit your beautiful lands recently. So, please join me in a journey towards decolonization, a pathway to regaining power over energy, environment, and the economy on the Navajo Nation. So, previous land use studies on the Navajo Nation were conducted by the Arizona State University, and essentially this was looked on the small scale of how they could make more meaningful plans at the local community level. However, this study focuses on larger systemic issues around land use on the Navajo Nation, as well as discussing how land use planning can be utilized by the Dene to implement meaningful change. This was done in 3 parts, the first being a literature review around previous land use studies, current land use plans on the Navajo Nation, and international indigenous land use planning. Community engagement unfortunately did not extend out into the larger community due to various constraints. However, I was partnered with the most incredible group of people through Indian Country Grassroots Support. This board was filled both with the Dene people and people who had lived in the community for decades, included retired judges, lawyers, land planners, traditional mentors, advocates. As well, there is a high-level regulatory review, and hopefully through these 3 parts, we're able to start answering the question of what hurdles need to be removed to enable the Dene to create their own land use plans that meaningfully represent their culture and traditions. So before we go any further, I just want to take a moment and talk to you about the land use plans that are actually used on the Navajo Nation and go over the acronyms you're going to hear me say a lot so that you know which plan I'm referring to. The first one is the Integrated Resource Management Plan, or IRMP, and these are used on a larger scale, so think the Navajo Nation as a whole or one of the agencies. So if you hear IRMP, then know that I'm talking about one of these larger scale plans. The other type is the Community Land Use Plans, or CLUPs, and these are used at the community level or the chapter level, of which there's 110 different chapters on the Navajo Nation. So if you hear me say the word CLUP, know that I'm talking to these more localized chapter plans. Now, regardless of the plan, whether it's the IRMP, which is federally funded and entirely directed, or the CLUPs, which are created through a committee of community volunteers that are directed and led through the BIA. Generally, they're both following Western formats, meaning they've been stripped of cultural and traditional elements such as kinship and land stewardship, meaning that these plans fail to represent the communities that are impacted by them. It also has led to many of the conditions that we see on the Navajo Nation today. Through studies like mine, the hope is that we're able to use land use planning to be able to address some of these issues. The first being fair and equitable access to affordable and clean energy. Currently, 32% of the homes on the Navajo Nation are without electricity. That equates to 14,000 homes without power, and it's no small task to be able to connect them to the grid. The second is reducing inequalities within nations and between nations. So due to the current state of regulations on the Navajo Nation, it is increasingly difficult to have economic development, business creation, or even to support oneself in a traditional manner. This has led to an unemployment rate that continues to hover around 48%. For perspective, in the United States in March of 2023, that rate was only 3.4%. And this has resulted in 36.5% of the people living below the poverty line. And again, in the greater US, that's about triple the number of what is experienced outside the Navajo Nation's borders. And the final is restoration of life on land. Due to the single-use permitting system that's on the Navajo Nation, it has removed the ability for families to herd their livestock and move them around in seasons. Instead, it's forced them to stay on single plots of land, which has led to a state of overgrazing and land degradation. As well, due to political policies, there has been a lot of extractive resources that have been promoted on the Navajo Nation. And this has led to a legacy of abandoned uranium mines. Currently, there's about 500 on or near the Navajo Nation. And although the U.S. federal government has committed $1.7 billion to the cleanup of the most at-risk on or near the nation, that only results in about 230 being cleaned up. That's less than half. Which brings us to the current plans on the Navajo Nation and what's actually missing from them. The first thing is community visions. On many of them, there isn't a vision statement at all. It's entirely missing. On many more, this was created either through the club committee or the chapter president, meaning that it didn't necessarily have community involvement to create. And on the remaining, the majority were focused entirely on economic development with very little cultural or traditional elements included. Now, this might be due to a lack of community engagement. Keep in mind, again, many of these plans are highly influenced through Western formats, and often community engagement means hosting a couple of meetings, hopefully people attend, that box is checked off as complete. Now, this doesn't necessarily work on the Navajo Nation. Out of the 60 clubs that I reviewed, only 2 of them did the committee go above and beyond trying to ensure community participation. This included intergenerational attempts, trying to include community members who might not normally attend these meetings, a variety of formats where they could voice their opinions. However, despite their honest efforts to make this happen, participation rate was still low. So why is that? Well, could be funding. A lot of these planning committees don't have a lot of funds to employ a variety of formats over a long period of time. It could also be on the individual level in that people can't afford to take a day off work or spend extended time periods at these planning initiatives. And a lot of the community members do live quite remotely, meaning transportation to and from these centralized locations for planning might not be attainable. And if they do make it to the meeting, then there's additional language barriers that most of the planning activities happen in English, which may exclude those that speak only Diné. There is also an overall distrust, both of government and government procedures, but also that these plans will actually be put into place for meaningful change. Many of the plans were created and nothing happened after, meaning there's questions as to why would people want to put in the effort again to try and do something that might not result in meaningful change. Due to a lot of these elements, that means that culture and tradition has been largely missing from these plans. The additional consideration we want to talk about is restricted land considerations. Now, land use on the Navajo Nation is incredibly complex. One of the first issues is contested areas between chapters. On this slide, you can see the areas that have purple striping through them. And these areas are contested land between different chapters as to whose chapter they belong to. In addition, there is the former Bennett Freeze area, the area that's outlined in blue. Now, there was a 40-year moratorium on development for this area, and as you can see, it affects 9 different chapters. This freeze has been removed, but obviously this meant that no planning could happen in those areas for a long time, and it continues to impact land use planning today. In addition, across the Navajo Nation, there is a checkerboard of land use titles. From the graphic on this slide, from an individual chapter on the Navajo Nation, you can see that there is a myriad of land titles for the Bureau of Land Management, for Indigenous allotment, for tribal trust land, for band land, for private land. And all of these different land titles come with different rules and regulations that must be adhered to. In fact, some of these even have a different federal agency that they are actually under the jurisdiction of, meaning that project approvals is quite complex on the Navajo Nation. In addition, there is a system of single lease and permits that are used across the nation. This is for agriculture, for business, for grazing, for home site leases, and all of these have to be used only for that purpose, and there cannot be any cross use. That means there aren't any home-based businesses, that your home might not necessarily be near your farm, that your livestock can't be near your home. And this is creating a lot of conditions that don't meet the cultural and traditional practices of the Dene. Also keep in mind that each one of these single-use permit and leaseholders have the right to veto projects across their land, meaning that if it doesn't agree with what they would like to see, even if it is for the betterment of the entire community, some of these projects can't happen. So how this relates to land use planning is that in large majority of the plans, the only planning area that was considered was land that was already previously withdrawn. That means they might have planned for 40 acres out of the entire chapter. In the ones where they considered the entire chapter, these plans may not have been able to be put into place because of a single veto by a permit or leaseholder. Also, keep in mind that this system of single-use permits and leases was implemented by the federal government in the 50s. By the 60s, they realized this wasn't working, and for federal lands, they moved to a multi-use sustainable yield practice. This extended to Indigenous communities in the late 80s, and it was written into the federal guidelines and even codified into acts that the creation of a united tribal vision and IRMP could be used to revise or waive regulations that didn't support the IRMP or the Indigenous way of life. Now, this seems like a pretty powerful mechanism that could be used to create meaningful change for the Dene. But why has that not actually been implemented on the Navajo Nation as of yet? Well, this could be because there's many hurdles still to overcome. The first one being access to funding. It's not as simple as the government allocating money to these chapters. There is a long regulatory approval that's required. This slide shows the Navajo Nation Fiscal Recovery Fund's approval process, and you can see all of the agencies that a proposal must go through before it can reach the Office of President and Vice President for a resolution to be passed and the money to make it to the chapter level. Unfortunately, because of all of these steps, often there is a gridlock and the funds don't make it to the chapter because the federal timeline runs out and those funds no longer are available. Also, this funding is often only available for shovel-ready projects. It's not available for planning or for maintenance or the administration of any of these plans. In fact, a large majority of these CLUPs were created through grants through the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, which essentially allowed these plans to be created in the early 2000s. However, there was no additional funding for these plans to be updated every 5 years as intended, meaning that it was hard for these documents to be actually agile or responsive to community needs. In addition, there's a bridging the gap in local expertise. This is both in Western formats and traditional formats. On the Western side, current plans have shown that bringing in external contractors doesn't meet the needs of the communities. So it lends to the need to create this capacity within the communities. The BIA has stated for these IRMPs to be accepted and to have the weight and the power that the nation would like, there's certain Western aspects that must be included. So again, having local professionals with the training to be able to provide this expertise could lead to more meaningful land use plans. On the traditional side, there's starting to be a gap between intergenerational learning and passing on of traditional knowledge. In part, this is due to migration of the youth away from the nation as their parents leave to find better paying jobs. It's also due to the westernization of younger generations' perspectives. Hopefully, through things like the Biden administration's acknowledgement of the importance of traditional ecological knowledge, both to Indigenous planning and to the greater U.S., there'll be greater funding for things like traditional land use studies, allowing for an intergenerational learning and knowledge sharing to occur. Another issue is competing land interests. Now, this can be communities versus individual needs, different goals between different generations, or even between those living on or off the Navajo Nation. So there needs to be more conversations to reduce this conflict, to understand where each other are coming from, which leads to the need for increased education as to the importance of community involvement in the creation of these vision and land use planning. And for the understanding that there is greater power with a greater number of individuals who participate. Another issue is the creation of a tribal vision. We saw some of the complexities of trying to create a community vision. Now imagine extending that to a tribal enrollment of around 400,000 people over a land area approximately the size of Portugal. Essentially means that this is going to require more time and more funding than most federal programs allow. And the final one is regulatory limitations. This is both at the federal and at the tribal level. However, we're going to get into that in a little more detail shortly. First, I would like to look at the results of looking at international Indigenous planning. This included plans that were outside of the Navajo Nation's borders and started at the Bears Ear National Monument in Utah. This was an intertribal planning initiative, and although this was created through Western formats and external contractors, there were more cultural and traditional elements. Part of this was due to the utilization of professionals called ethnographers. Now, unlike just regurgitating what it is in archaeological historical data, these professionals immerse themselves in a culture and a community, and this might be a potential way forward as they transition between external contractors to building that capacity within. And they also utilize Indigenous peoples that combine both of their traditional and their Western knowledge through the creation of professions such as ethnobotany. We can talk about that more in the questions. Next, I moved over to Brazil because the Brazilian president has recently acknowledged that through the demarcation process, or the return of tribal lands to the indigenous peoples, has led to reforestation and conservation of the Amazon forest. Now, my Portuguese is limited, and I would argue that Google Translate's Portuguese was also limited, so I didn't go too far into a lot of these plans. However, there's some really interesting things I learned. The first one is that they too were questioning how to get traditional information to younger generations. And they took the traditional land use study and essentially turned it into ethnomapping, which was more interactive. What they did is they took both the elders and the youths and they took them to these locations as they started to map all of the culturally significant areas, allowing for that teaching to happen. It also created a cultural resource that was within the control of that community and could be used for teaching, land use planning, or for political advocacy. The next thing that they also did was they started in-house training of environmental agents. Now, again, this was through an outside organization in partnership with the Indigenous community, but it was for land use planning specific with the ways that were important to them and allowed for federal accreditation. Now, this has been talked about on the Navajo Nation, and this is currently happening in Canada through Eco Canada's BEARS program, but it is definitely a very interesting initiative. New Zealand had examples of plans that had cultural and traditional elements that definitely could be referred to, but I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the plans I found in Canada. The first would be from the Lequimel First Nations of BC. Now they created their land use plan, but their intention from creating this land use plan was to create a larger environmental management plan, which essentially established their land code. So following the direction of the vision and their IRMP, they created the regulatory framework that they wanted to see on their in their communities. And then this was agreed upon with the federal government and superseded the previous regulations. Now I know that there are already a lot of land use laws, regulations, all sorts of things are already created for the Navajo Nation, but they're obviously not working. So my suggestion is to incorporate a strategic environmental assessment while the creation of this tribal vision and tribal RMP is happening. Essentially, that means that your vision and your plan can direct the way that this regulatory framework assessment occurs, meaning how are the land use laws that are currently in place inhibiting the vision that you see? What sort of framework would actually support this IRMP and vision? And how do we get funding to the local chapters so that they can actually do something about that? So that was one from them. And the other nation that I looked at in Canada was the Pawangasi, and their traditional lands extend over the border of Manitoba and Ontario. I learned quite a bit from this community, which is a very traditional community, still very much based in hunting, trapping, gathering, fishing. So their traditional lifestyle was exceptionally important to them. The first thing is they were focused on decentralized power because they wanted to limit the environmental impacts of large infrastructure projects that would have in the areas to be able to connect them to the grid. Now, how this could relate to the Navajo Nation, because I know they've already discussed this, is with the complex land use and the different land users, the less amount of people that have to be involved to get a project approved means that it might get traction a lot faster. The next thing that I learned from them was that they recognize the overlapping traditional areas. So their land use plan was created with the intention that neighboring Indigenous communities would have the ability to review, comment, give feedback, and collaborate on this. And it was this effort of collaboration that I found particularly interested because there are a lot of contested borders on the Navajo Nations, and perhaps if part of the vision is for these plans to be developed with collaboration in mind, it might help plan for these areas that might not otherwise be addressed. Now, the most important thing that I found in these plans was their pre-planning and planning initiatives. This included traditional land use studies, traditional use interviews, memory mapping, and the creation of a community map atlas. This means that they created an entire cultural resource for their community to use, again, within their own control, that could be used for their visioning and land use planning, as well as for political maneuvering. Definitely something I think can be used on the Navajo Nation. Now that takes me to the regulatory assessment. Keep in mind this is very high level because, as I discussed, I think it is important for an extensive regulatory review to happen in combination with the tribal vision and IRMP so it can be guided by the communities. So there is an intricate web of regulations both at the federal and at the tribal level. So mostly what I want to focus on here is that it is in writing through the federal government that the creation of a tribal vision and IRMP has the ability to revise or waive regulations to support that IRMP, which really emphasize the importance to create these. And I also noticed that some of the major limitations that I saw were actually at the tribal level. So it might not be moving the mountains that communities have been led to believe to be able to make meaningful change. This highlights the importance of the creation of this tribal vision and IRMP, and for these to both have more power, that there needs to be a greater number of voices to help push for meaningful change. So this brings me to the recommendations, and this starts at the pre-planning phase, where we're looking at things like the development of traditional land use studies and ethnomapping to create cultural resources within the control and power of the communities that can be used for intergenerational learning as well as for land use planning and political advocacy. There's the capacity building, both in the Western and traditional formats, so that these plans can be created by local people with local interests at heart. And there is the envisioning process. And as stated, the more voices that are a part of the envisioning process, the more powerful that this becomes. There is also regulatory mapping. A lot of Navajo Nation code hasn't actually been available online for years, and through exhaustive efforts of Indian country grassroots support and externs, they have actually tracked down all of this information to make it publicly available, and are currently in a position to take on something such as a strategic environmental assessment in a meaningful way. So that takes us to the next part, which is the tribal visioning and the creation of the tribal IRMP. Again, cannot emphasize enough the importance of community involvement in this, and that the more voices that are involved, the more powerful it becomes, the more weight it will have. And that the strategic environmental assessment should occur at the same time so that the vision and the planning can actually guide this to understand what land use regulations and legislation needs to be revised or wavered and what should be put into its place. In addition, also looking at the issues with the funding process. How do we get funds actually to the communities so they're able to use this? So that hopefully when it's time for the approval of the IRMP, the strategic environmental assessment can also be put into place as a replacement regulatory framework, meaning that these projects actually can happen. And then all of this can be used to guide and help with community vision and creation of clubs. When we get to the community level, again, please keep in mind that these are volunteers, and that means that they need you, community members, to volunteer and be a part of this. And even if you do not have the time to contribute to the full planning process, volunteer in ways to help make the process easier. Maybe that's picking up neighbors to bring them to planning meetings, or maybe that's delivering and picking up surveys. Ask yourself how you can get involved, how you can get your voice, and how you can get the voices of those you care about into this process. Now, there's lots of room for future research. If you need ideas, contact me. The limitations I'd like to discuss, though, positionality. I'm of European descent. My background is in science. My industry experience is upstream oil and gas, so it is the extractive industries. None of this background lent any extra ability for me to be able to see this from the traditional point of view. So there was a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning, and I have to thank my partners for their patience as I struggled through this and started to learn to view this from a different lens. But as much as I've tried to make sure that I can present this from the community's level, there still is coloring of that lens from my previous experience. So I want to acknowledge that. The other limitations that I discussed were the need for further community engagement, again, so that we understand more things people would like to see in these things, and limitations in the translation of international plans. So with greater time, perhaps more robust analysis of international Indigenous plans can happen. With that, I would like to thank you to everybody who contributed their wisdom and insight into this project. It couldn't have been what it is without you, and I am forever grateful and will be forever changed from the experience. Thank you so much.